I've been invited to participate in a joint quest for an answer to the question of why democracy is in danger and what the challenges to democratic coexistence are. Naturally, in my keynote, I can rely mainly on my own research, which focuses on Hungary, but it can be stated with certainty that Hungary's culture and philosophy are well harmonized with those in the cultural space of Central and Eastern Europe, where the same tendencies can be observed. In describing these tendencies, I must touch briefly on the Enlightenment, as a result of which, instead of God, humanity has become the center of thought. But together with universalism also began, especially in the German and East Central European cultural area, the agony of modernity and universalism, that is, the so-called counter-modernity, the shadow side of the Enlightenment. From the late 18th century, after the Enlightenment, historical development took diverse directions in Western, Central and Eastern Europe. Although the French Revolution 1789 stirred up nations, it did so in different ways in Western and Eastern Europe, as a result of which a so-called Western and Eastern modernity developed. Historical development took place differently in the Habsburg Empire from Western Europe, but very, very similarly to Germany. While the basis of the French interpretation of state was the Western interpretation of the political concept of nation, the German and East Central European interpretations of state went on to develop as ethnic völkisch concept of nation. Based on concept of nation in German idealism, this ideology spread across the German and Habsburg empires as knowledge transfer. In this völkisch worldview, since the 19th century, people and nation, as in the German understanding, have been understood as a community of spacious ancestors, blood or racial communities. The German völkisch means racial national, and the ethnic völkisch concept of nation is a prisoner of the concept of Volk and the related diverse attributed meanings. According to the German interpretation of the term Volk, do also the East Central European interpretations, for example in Hungarian nép or in Slavic národ, not refer to the English or French terms people or purple, which are interpreted in their meaning as the coexistence of equal individuals, but are instead to be interpreted in their ethnic racial meaning as a homogeneous entity. Nor do the Hungarian term nép or the Slavic term národ, folk, refer here to the lower strata of social hierarchy. Rather, they represent an ethnic homogeneous community in German Volksgemeinschaft. This is related to racism, in that ethnic view is part of racial view. An ethnic community, Volksgemeinschaft, united by cultural and biological identity, is regarded as race. This was clear to the Hungarian historian Peter Honák too, who wrote, I quote, "In our region, the shaping of consciousness followed by the linguistic ethnic concept of nation of German Romanticism rather than the French example. In this approach, the term nép, folk, did not represent the working masses below nobility and the bourgeoisie. Instead, it referred to an ethnic identity reaching back to an idealized archaic community, and later, at the end of the century, the term népi, in German völkisch, acquired a meaning identifiable as racial. This concept of nation and practice of organization led to racism influenced by social Darwinism, conservative social reform and aggressive nationalism, whose discriminative case of law and antisemitism resulted in a horrible destruction of ideas and genocide in Germany, Austria, Hungary and Romania, and practically everywhere in the region in the second quarter of the 20th century. As also demonstrated by the Czech historian Miroslav Hroch, the expression folk and the relevant expressions in Central Eastern Europe semantically related to the word gens. They are ethnicizing terms, thus also homogenizing and imply an ancestral, gentilistic and racist view. Thus, in the course of development of the concept of nation, in Central and Eastern Europe the term folk, nation, national culture and national character became the most important ones that were used instead of or together with the term race, providing the sense of togetherness. The Enlightenment was also connected with secularization, and which was linked to a drastic decrease in the Church's power. In this process, however, the demand for religious contents persisted. Pre-Enlightenment Christian universal religious contents were transformed into post-Enlightenment, this worldly, everyday contents, and the role of God was replaced with everyday elements such as folk, nation, race, language, blood, or land, for example, motherland. We are dealing with this worldly metaphysics or spiritualism, in which these elements have become the subject of worship as pagan deities. These are also elements of a so-called Aryan white utopia. As blood as a cohesive element is not biological in nature in this ideology, instead it belongs to a moral category. The basis for group identity and supposed ancestry was and is provided by creed, in German Glaubensbekenntnis. National creed is, for example, the title of the current basic law of Hungary. However, this creed is not Christian, and the concept of a folk nation and the belief in a community of blood stand in striking contrast with universal Christianity. It's important to note that this ideology is per se discriminative because advocating homogeneity that does not exist in reality, the only way it can strengthen its self-identity is by constantly creating otherness. The concept of political nation exists hardly in the countries of Central Europe. The excluding identification with people, folk, and nation is still constitutive and goes hand in hand with a widespread need for homogeneity, which is experienced as harmony of the national community. For a large part of political unity in Central and East Central Europe, the revolutionary idea of universalism and individualism is still missing. Nation and homeland, in German Heimat, has experienced the effect of a mother imago which expresses the sense of security so that it functions as a social bracket. Nation and folk constitute a political unity elevated to metaphorical heights, which displays the concept of universal God. The folkish worldview is like a religion, but despite the fact that God and Christianity are permanently pointed out in it, it does not know the motive of grace and charity inherent in the universalist denominations, but always seeks the evil around to be able to define himself in contrast as the good. Since the only way national identity can strengthen its self-identity is by constantly creating otherness, and enemies are searched for even in the last corner, this imagined harmony of the folk cannot be separated from persecution and the fear of being persecuted. Terms such as Christianity, people, folk, and nation, national culture, or national character are exclusive. These are the mostly terms of negations which are associated with the meaning of non-Jewish, non-Romani, non-homosexual, with male supremacism, and misogyny. So in this context, these terms include a group-focused enmity. In my view, Völkisch metaphysics, or Christianity from the right, as an everyday religion, is currently the most striking threat to democracy. If delusional phantasma determine political and cultural life, especially in Hungary on a constitutional basis, they can distort reality. In this way, they can become the norm of a destructive, negative integration in which group of people find each other by the projection of anger. Their aim is then to create an imagined, ultimately cosmically controlled harmony that promises homogeneity. This promise is threatening at the same time because it can only be maintained by removing the unworthy of life which is assumed as non-identical or without identity. Instead of the Christian charity, which focuses on the needy of the individuals and on brotherly love, Völkisch worldview focuses on the needy, on the nation, and of the love of species. It also turns the Christian doctrine of salvation radically into its opposite, because it starts from the culturally pessimistic assumption that Christian salvation has failed because the present has degenerated and despiritualized, which is why the world must be redeemed again by a spiritual leader. In it, however, redemption, in contrast to Christian eschatology, does not mean liberation from sins after death, but rather reincarnation, in which only those of the same species can participate. Its universalism is not identical with the universal human rights emancipatory approach. Instead, we are facing an identitarian everyday spiritualism in which the anti-emancipatory approach is universalized. I agree with publicist Caroline Emke, who has recently launched A New Enlightenment, and with philosopher Julian Niederrümelin, who has also recently called for a return to the values of humanism with a cosmopolitan perspective. Only when we understand and internalize the principles of universal human rights can we defend democracy and open society. Therefore, the inviolability of human dignity must be communicated and internalized. Thank you very much.